be beautiful, and be sad. Before we get this video started, adult things will be spoken of. Brothers and sisters, is it not irritating? Is it not disappointing when a pastor steps out of his lane, stops just preaching and printing bulletins, and actually has something to say about life? This is unacceptable. A pastor is not a philosopher, a poet, a psychologist. Before we get started, some housekeeping. Don't forget to like this video, share, etc., so on, all the usual social media things. So today I want to talk about a quote of Doug Wilson's from his book Fidelity, which is many years old now. And this quote continues to surface and resurface. There has recently been another kerfuffle involving Pastor Wilson, and he's always in that same kerfuffle. It keeps getting resurrected, and this quote is always in that kerfuffle. So I'm going to read the quote to you and then talk about how pastors should actually talk about these things. What hath Pastor Wilson said? This is from a book called Fidelity, What It Means to Be a One-Woman Man, talking about the sexual dynamic. In other words, however we try, the sexual act cannot be made into an egalitarian pleasuring party. A man penetrates, conquers, colonizes, plants. A woman receives, surrenders, accepts. This is, of course, offensive to all egalitarians, and so our culture has rebelled against the concept of authority and submission in marriage. This means that we have sought to suppress the concepts of authority and submission as they relate to the marriage bed. True authority and true submission are therefore an erotic necessity. Authority, submission, saying things like a man penetrates, conquers, colonizes, a woman receives, surrenders, accepts. How dare he? Is Pastor Wilson a poet by any chance? I mean, he's written a book of poetry, but he's a pastor. Stay in your lane, sir. Poets do things like what Allen Ginsberg has done. His most seminal poem is, well, full of semen. His most seminal poem is about being dominated by others in random places and behaving like an animal. His second most influential poem has the first 20 lines start with, "Please, master, can I touch your?" "Please, master, can I touch your cheek?" "Please, master, can I touch your?" "Please, master, can I touch your?" And ends with lines that I can't read on this video, but "I do love you, please, master," are the very final words. I can't even urge you to go look up this poem, but I can tell you that Ginsberg's reputation is intact because he's a poet and he can talk about craving a master, particularly because he's a man. Or we could take a Christian poet, John Donne, famously a writer of erotic poetry. And then he became a Christian, and what did he do? He wrote a poem in which he urged God to do to his heart what a 50s movie star might have done to the woman he wanted when she didn't know what was best for her. Batter my heart I will not be, oh goodness, I'm trying to quote a poem now and I'm failing. But unless you ravage me, is what he says. He wants God to take him. He was a writer of erotic poetry, and he moved that into the theological world. Wow. And that's good. That's okay, because he's a poet. Pastor Wilson is not a poet. Is Pastor Wilson a psychologist? Psychologists are allowed to comment on sexual dynamics. Let's quote Leon Seltzer. The question then arises, do women experience relational power in knowing that they're erotically cherished and adored, the object of a man's strongest craving? And is this finally akin to Henry Kissinger's immortal line, power is the ultimate aphrodisiac? If the male is so enamored of a woman that he'll do anything to make her his own, if he's enslaved by his boundless passion, then who, after all, is in charge of the relationship? Obviously, however much an alpha he may be, his obsessive desire for her ends up putting her in control of the relationship. Initially, she may have had to surrender to him, but now he's the one who must capitulate. In fact, her passivity, reserve, and submissiveness can be seen as revealing a certain sexual cunning. How can these classically feminine qualities not be seen as ultimately giving her an advantage, a means of finally gaining the relational upper hand? There we have it, ladies and gentlemen. A sexual psychologist, Leon Seltzer. She surrenders, but now he must capitulate. She is passive, reserved, and submissive, and that leads her to dominate, to be in control. It's okay. It's, in fact, good for the psychologist to say these things because this is what he works in. He works with sex, and he knows that conquest and surrender are part of the sexual dynamic, an integral part. And he has to counsel people. Pastors don't have to counsel people about marriage, about sex. Psychologists do. Finally, let's talk about philosophers. Philosophers have things to say about life. They sit there, they think about life, they meditate. What pastors meditate? And the philosophers take these meditations and they scribble them down for us to be enriched by them, to understand our place in the universe, where we're going, and how to have sex and what sex is like. That mistress of French letters, Madame de Staël, famously said, the desire of the man is for the woman. The desire of the woman is for the desire of the man. Feminist philosopher Catherine McKinnon asked, are women human? Christian writer and philosopher Dorothy Sayers asked, are women human? But most importantly, I think that we need a French philosopher, because French philosophers are the real philosophers. Allow me to read to you a quote from Jean-Paul Sartre. The whole is something which longs to be filled. The small child is drawn as if by magic to holes. He cannot restrain himself from putting in his finger or his whole arm. He makes a symbolic sacrifice of his body to cause the void to disappear and a plenitude of being to exist. The fundamental tendency of human beings to stop up holes persists throughout life, symbolically and in reality. And only from this standpoint can we understand why the feminine sex is obscene. It is obscene because it is a whole, and because it sends out an appeal for a plenitude of flesh. A woman also senses her condition as such an appeal, such an enticement. Thus, every whole becomes something obscene because it is an obscene expectation. Someone should look up the etymology of the word vagina at this point. Now, it's good that a figure like Sartre, who is controversial, and controversial in feminist circles, because he was a horrible person, as was his wife, both horrible people who abused each other and others, but he can still be taken seriously. He should still be taken seriously. He will never be canceled because he is a French philosopher. And this leads me to the lesson that I want to give pastors, and particularly Pastor Wilson, about how to talk about such things, how to stay in your lane, or perhaps expand your lane. Ah, ma chérie, tu savais que je t'aime. In other words, however we try, the sexual act cannot be made into an egalitarian, pleasuring party. A man, he penetrates, he conquers, he colonizes, he plants. A woman, she receives, she surrenders, she accepts. This is, of course, offensive to all egalitarians. And so, our culture has rebelled against the very concept of authority and submission in marriage. This means that we have sought to suppress the concepts of authority and submission as they relate to the marriage bed. True authority and true submission are therefore an erotic necessity. No? C'est vrai. Be beautiful and be sad. Can we get off this, please, Christians? This quote, that's all. And this attitude. If you guys want to keep arguing about what's going on in Moscow and Pastor Wilson, go do it. Keep rehashing the same old stuff. Whatever, I have no comment about it. I do have a comment about intellectual honesty. Oh goodness, it blows my mind, and I can't keep the cigarette lit. Address ideas, address content, and be honest with what you yourself have written, with what you yourself have read and taken in. And really, if you truly believe that there's something wrong with that text, not with the idea, you could disagree with the idea, but something wrong with having written it, with putting it out there, then I feel sorry for the West and sorry for Western and Christian intellectual tradition. The peace of Christ be upon you.
Aí sim é um homem de verdade, não é esses troços do grupo não, essas carcaças velhas, uó, fim de carreira.
Cadê você, profeta, autarquia? Hein? Pedrada no inferno, fala comigo aí, matador de demônio. Hein?